I'd just like to then introduce our panel. Pravant, if you want to come forward. So the panel is about artificial intelligence, using artificial intelligence for predicting shortages and ensuring that there's no risk on supply. I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thanks much. Good morning, everyone. If the panelists for this panel may please join us here at stage. I'm not Sku. I'm the substitute moderator for this session. Stu can make it here. So my name is Prashant Yadav. I'm a professor of technology and operations management at INSEAD. I run the INSEAD Africa initiative. This session is about what is the potential of using machine learning and artificial intelligence for predicting drug shortages, for mitigating the risk of shortage in the pharmaceutical and medicine supply chain. What are things that companies and organizations are already doing? Where can we do more? What are the needs for new streams of data? And how to build this field so that it starts becoming to be truly mainstream in terms of governments, national departments of health, global agencies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, API manufacturers, all of them start actively and effectively start using the outputs that may come out from such use of AI and machine learning and the analytical models that some of our panelists are going to talk about. So that's the preface to this morning's session. Again, I want to remind you, we are talking about the use of AI and machine learning for drug shortages and supply chain risks. While you all may think of multiple use cases for AI and machine learning in the healthcare value chain, for this discussion, we'll try and focus on that, and at times our panelists will remind us that that's not probably the most important one according to them. Maybe something else is equally important, or you all can bring that out in the discussion. So I will start by introducing our panelists here. So we have Matt Christian. He's the Director of Supply Chain Insight as the US Pharmacopoeia, USP. We have Dan Rosen. He's the Director of New Business at Maisha Meds, a health tech startup in Kenya. And we have Glaudina Lutz, who's the Head of Innovation in the Department of Health Innovation in South African's Technology Innovation Agency. So 3 panelists who bring very different perspectives. Let me start by posing an opening question to Christian and to Dan and to Glaudina. Where are you starting to see the role of machine learning and artificial intelligence in your work? And what was the genesis of some of this? Why did you start thinking about using new analytics to solve drug supply chain shortages and mapping out supply risk and so on? So start with Matt.
Yep, thank you. So at US Pharmacopoeia, our mission is to protect the supply of quality medicines for patients. So to that end, we built the USP Medicine Supply Map, which is an AI-based solution that aggregates 40 different data sets to identify, characterize, and quantify risk in the supply chain. And one of the great things about AI is it allows you to aggregate and interpret a diverse and complex set of data, everything from trade data to patient data to manufacturing data with USP's standards usage information to derive insights. One recent project we did for the EU was looking at the supply chain of oseltamivir, an antiviral drug. We first went out and studied what is their regional capacity to produce the capsules of oseltamivir. And we found they have pretty robust finished dosage form manufacturing capacity. We then went one step up, looking at trade data to see, all right, for those finished dosage form manufacturers, how are the active pharmaceutical ingredients manufacturers? Where are they located? We found once again that the EU had pretty robust capacity in that space. It wasn't until we went one generation up, one node up in the supply chain, and looked at the key starting materials. And of the 3 key starting materials for oseltamivir, we found that over 99% of their volume was from China. So that's a sole point of failure, a massive geographic dependence on a single region for them. And this sort of analysis isn't possible without AI. To have a human analyst pour through the millions of trade records to be able to come up with those insights just isn't feasible. So in this region, Africa imports over 70% of their pharmaceutical products, and there's several initiatives underway to increase the capacity of the manufacturing ecosystem for pharmaceutical products. And it's very important to look not just at the finished dosage form, but also study how these supply chain nodes connect further upstream to understand the true geographic dependence on various regions.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
And similar question to you, Dan. Why AI? Firstly, what is the problem you are trying to solve in this particular use of AI and machine learning? And then why AI?
Thanks, Prashant. So I first started looking into the supply security space around COVID. India stopped the export of a number of key commodities. Maisha works with a network of pharmacies and clinics across the continent that we've developed and digitized. And we were trying to ask the question, well, how long does it take to go from an export ban to starting to see shortages and price spikes at the last mile? And then from there, we started asking the question, well, that's not really enough time to make a decision. So you've got about 3 months between maybe a disruption of finished goods traveling to a country. What if we looked further upstream? What if we start looking at the API prices? What if we start looking at the key starting material volumes? And then that really led us into a scope of work around, could we predict when there might be a problem before it happens? And actually, somewhat similarly to Matt, Matt and I were both comparing notes last night about the vagaries of international trade data. So we have some slight similarities in how we're trying to approach this problem. But I think what I would say I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the data a bit later. But if we take these problems of shortages and break them into global, national, and subnational, the types of data that you need for those 3 problems are very, very different. In some ways, the AI is actually potentially not the rate-limiting step of this entire process. The AI component is allowing us to analyze more molecules faster, more efficiently than ever. But actually, the quality of the data and the data sets that are available and the caveats of those data sets is much more important, in a sense, than the capacity of the AI itself. The AI is not the rate-limiting step so much as an enabler to encourage us to bring together more data sets and better data sets to be able to turn it into something more useful.
Thanks, Dan. So 2 points we've heard. One is the ability to go real upstream and look at all these flows, not just at the finished product, but key starting material level, explodes the number of data flows and links and other things that you have to look at, and a human analyst is not probably most efficient way of doing it, and that's what Matt highlighted as the value of using AI. Dan is bringing out another point, which is as these disparate data streams, different disconnected data sets, can you bring them together, and bringing them together could be something which machine learning and AI algorithms could help us. Claudina, your department looks at health innovation with a much wider angle lens than what we are talking about here. But for this particular use case, are you and your colleagues looking at how can machine learning or other methods of new analytics be used to predict medicine shortages, give some advice or early warning to the National Department of Health?
Yes, we are sort of working with the National Department of Health to see how we can help. But we sit with a problem that you sit with 9 independent provinces, and that each one wants to do his own thing. And you also look at one of the problems is the financing, the payments that needs to go with it. So yes, one of the we started off with actually start looking at your antimicrobials because of the whole antimicrobial resistance thing that we to predict where are the specific high spots, why are certain areas buying more antibiotics, and then to actually pinpoint pain points across the supply chain, just to start off with that. But we also need to get the systems to start talking to one another, and that is sort of an interesting thing. And for that, your machine learning is one of the, that can assist in this process that the systems start to talk to one another. But what we've learned through COVID was, even if you have a number of systems in place, but as is mentioned, your major supplier of your, either your initial products or your APIs is sitting in China and India, and if those borders close, then whether you got all the data of how many paracetamol tablets you need, but you can't get it into the country. This is one of the major drive forces for why Africa is now seeing to what extent there can be a certain amount of local manufacturing. But again, it is how do you use then the idea that they're putting together of pool procurement, and I think this is where AI can play that role to bring together the data so that countries can sort of say, yes, we for this tablets or whatever, we need these and these amounts of it. In order then to start sourcing where it's come from, but also at the same time, we need to look at the quality of the products that's being made available. So it's a very complex system, and I think this is where AI can actually start bringing in the different elements to assist your regulating authorities, but also then your end users, your national governments that needs to buy the medicines. Yeah.
Thank you, Claudina. I think another useful reminder that while we're talking about using AI and machine learning to predict shortages, the AMR example that Claudina cites reminds us that sometimes it can also be useful to predict overuse, irrational use, other aspects in the value chain which are not just related to shortages but are about too much purchasing or too much dispensing. Right? So another use case comes out from what you described, but one thing that stands across the three panelists is the ability to predict and know with some notice if there is going to be a shortage upstream in the supply chain, not just a national stockout, but a regional or a global stockout when suppliers and their suppliers are unable to keep up with changes in demand or supply disruptions. Knowing that faster, quicker will allow national procurement, distributors, other actors in the system to take action proactively. So that stands out across the three panelists. I'll go back to you, Matt, and question here is, yes, we have the analytical machinery. A lot of people now say use of machine learning can become much more easier with the general purpose technologies that are coming out for using it. But the key constraint is, where do you get the data? And in the world of medicine supply chains, in particular in Africa, we oftentimes struggle to move from what we call as petite data to big data. We're still operating in a relatively scarce data environment. So tell us, in your project, where do the different data streams come from? Is that a challenge? Have we started to solve it systematically already?
Yeah, I think regards to where the data comes from, so because the pharmaceutical supply chains are so global, we see obvious patterns to where certain finished dosage manufacturers in various regions are all relying on the same key starting materials or active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers. To that extent, the global data is still very valuable, even within Africa at this regional level. To get more granular data, you're going to have to collect it. And collecting it is expensive. It involves collaboration partners that you've got to basically convince this is worth your time to sit here, give away potentially confidential information, or at least the ability to be confidential, and help me aggregate it for you. So to that extent, when we're going out to procure new data sources or establish forums for convening new data sources, it's important to demonstrate some of the value. And one of the values that we found is speed and time. So if you get insights faster, that enables you to make better, quicker decisions. Supply chain planners are extremely creative. Whenever there's a supply chain crisis, there is always a solution, but some of those solutions are very expensive. So switching modes of transportation from your regular, we'll say marine shipments into an emergency air shipment is very costly. So that is one way you could demonstrate, if we're able to share this information, if we're able to get these insights to stakeholders faster, then we can save money across our supply chain and ultimately extend access to critical medications for our patients.
Thanks, Matt. Dan, staying on the topic of where does the data come from? You are a health tech startup that collects a unique data set. You bring that together with other data sets. Tell us, how do you assemble and curate the data that is needed to feed into the analytical engine for shortage prediction?
Yeah, so my work focuses very heavily on health commodities in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't say to know as much about South Africa specifically, but across sub-Saharan Africa, the starting point that conceptually I start from is that every data set has a problem. There is no such thing as a perfect data set in this part of the world with respect to supply chain. So I have a conceptual model, which is that there's really 7 different levels at which one can collect data in the supply chain. And that's going as far away from the patient as you humanly can, all the way up to key starting material manufacturing, let's say theoretically in China, through to API manufacturing. Then you've got your finished goods exports, and sitting around that sort of level, you've also got your manufacturer data, you've got your procurement records data. Then you've got your country-level import records from the customs authorities or the regulatory agencies. And then sitting under that, you've got your wholesale layer, then you've got your facilities, and then right at the bottom, you've got electronic medical records or health insurance data. And that's as close to the patient as you can humanly go. Now, what we find is that the further away from the patient that you are, the relatively cheaper and easier it is to aggregate the data in such a way as to have something which is representative enough to make a decision upon. However, the further away that you move from the patient, the fewer use cases there tends to be for the data itself. And conversely, the closer that you move to the patient, it becomes much, much more difficult to convince 20,000 facilities in a country to use the same system and then train them on data quality so that your data is very harmonized and it all runs exactly the way that it's supposed to. That is incredibly difficult and expensive to do. But the number of decisions that you can make if you have that level of granularity of last mile data is much, much higher. So in my career, I've built data sets out of the key starting materials data, the API data, the finished goods data. I helped build a wholesale data audit for IQVIA in Kenya back in 2015. And we're currently building a network of, we've got 3,500 pharmacies and clinics serving 1.3 million patients across Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and Tanzania. Now, my way that I think about data is the best way to solve for the problems of each individual data set is by triangulation and combination of different data sets together. And I think that an over-reliance on any one particular data set is a mistake. I think an over-reliance on surveys and on traditional methods, whilst it was what was necessary in the past, is inefficient and expensive as newer tools become available.
So, remarkable combination of upstream data that comes from the variety of sources that Matt also described, and build it together with downstream data, which is coming from retail pharmacy level, right? And once you bring them together, you have a much wider end-to-end insight or insight-generating engine in some ways. Excellent. We'll come back to what that enables us to ask you that in a minute. But Claudina, when you think about data, not just upstream data, which our two panelists have talked about, but data about use that's coming from the provinces and from multiple systems that work in the healthcare sector, how do you think about bringing them together so that it can eventually be meaningful for AI and machine learning engines?
That is actually the challenge. And as you know, garbage in, garbage out. And that is the main problem when you've got diverse sections, sets of data to talk to one another. And in South Africa, you've got the public health sector and the private healthcare that is fairly separated from one another. But one of the things is, yes, you can get the data on the moment at national level, but sort of 3 months after. It's not on-time data. But your supply chain person within a health region that needs to actually order the necessary drugs and so on, there must be some kind of, instead of going, I've got so many boxes of this and so many boxes, but that actually to eventually integrate the patient record with what is expected for that specific area. And because of the diversity in South Africa, and you have sort of areas where TB is more predominant or where HIV is more predominant, you can't say for each area, this is the drugs that you're going to need. You actually need to be more specific. So the integration between your patient record and eventually that is what needs to feed into the system. But that is the main challenge in South Africa, is actually how do you utilize that information then to feed up in the system and what is needed. Then you also sit with the fact that we do the secondary manufacturing of a large number of the medicines that's being used. Up to a point, it becomes, yes, the Department of Health will have the necessary information, but then you get into proprietary areas. Your big pharma companies is not going to say to you, I've got problems getting this and this and this, or I've oversupplied of this. So you also then said, yes, you can use it for public health, for predictions, but the moment when you start entering into the business of drugs manufacturing, then immediately the people say, it's mine, it's my proprietary information, so you're not going to get that. You can tell them what you want and that's it. And I'm not going to even try to work with your Aspens or your Ciplas or whatever to say to him, no, but it ends up, this is the list that we need. Then there's a step beyond that the industry need to take further then. So there's a clear divide on where you can stop from a government side, yeah.
Very interesting point, Claudina. So one is, in trying to predict shortages, we don't have to just think about supply side, we have to think about demand data. And what Claudina is highlighting is that demand data comes from better ability to digitize patient records, use data, requisition data at the health clinic, at the health facility, at the pharmacy level, some of which Maisha Metz, for example, does at Kenya. But in the larger National Department of Health, that system has a lot of fragmentation, doesn't systematically get you the demand data, and unless we can bring the two pieces together, our ability to predict shortages, not shortages that are resulting from supply disruption, but shortages that are resulting from poor matching of demand and supply, remains weaker. And the other point she's highlighting is that simpleton like me would say, why don't you just ask the manufacturers, who are their API suppliers, who are their KSM suppliers, how much did they supply last month to them? Why shouldn't it be as simple? So she's highlighting why the incentives to get data from the different actors in the supply chain are not that linear and straightforward as we sometimes imagine. Okay, so I want to ask you, Matt, you brought up the oseltamivir, Tamiflu example from the EU, and you highlighted that the challenges lie real upstream, not at the API level, not at the finished product level, at the KSM level, perhaps even before KSM. When you learn about something like this, what is the value? Who do you take this output to? Who can act on it and how? So in the Tamiflu example, who would act on this to do something?
Yeah, so that particular Tamiflu exercise was an exercise for EU regulators to help them understand their supply chain vulnerabilities. But in general, when we look, we try to partner with stakeholders that can take meaningful actions, because simply blasting out information on this is an inevitable drug shortage is irresponsible, because what you're going to do is create a run on the store, lots of panic buying and hoarding type behaviors. So we look to partner with the individual stakeholders that can take mitigative actions. So in the case of manufacturers, manufacturers can use this sort of early warning system, predictive information, to optimize their portfolio planning, figuring out which products are going to be most opportunistic for them to produce over the next quarter or the next year. Then we look at distributors, and they can see sort of matching up supply and demand, figuring out where they need to put their resources with regards to inventory, for instance. And then all the way down to the purchasers, which in the US are the large hospital systems, helping them identify these are the individual spots where you might need to negotiate longer supply contracts with your distributors and manufacturers just to ensure a continuity of supply, because this supply chain is risky. So ultimately, it depends on the application, but there is I feel a burden on the technical data scientists behind the analysis, not to just publish every insight that comes to mind, but think about what is the impact of communicating this particular information to a given stakeholder.
Thanks. Dan, do you have similar examples like the oseltamivir that Matt brought out on what is the use upstream? How does that change the way people take actions or policy changes or purchasing changes?
Yeah, thanks, Prashant. So the example that I was going to give for this talk was, so from about 2017 to mid-2021, 2022, the price of a kilo of vegetal artemisinin hovered at about $180. Then in 2022, rumors started circulating about potential for shortages, and we saw prices spike all the way up to about $250 a kilo. Now this made producing vegetal artemisinin very attractive for the farmers in China.
Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Tell us, what is artemisinin? What is it used for?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Artemisinin is a key starting material for the manufacture of almost all of the first-line anti-malarial medications. Dealing with malaria in sub-Saharan Africa without artemisinin would be an enormous global challenge that probably we don't necessarily want to go down the line of thinking of what that might look like. But price got really, really high, so the farmers start producing large amounts. And then the price crashes, and now the price is $90 a kilo. So how are the farmers likely to react to the price now being $90 a kilo? Now, there is no shortage currently, and the policy response to this was that the Gates Foundation has invested in a company called Huve Pharma to start producing semi-synthetic artemisinin as a way to introduce excess capacity into the artemisinin market to reduce the dependence on farmers in China. There's some production in Madagascar as well. But this is an example of how the data can inform us on the volume of the commodities, the price per kilo, but that's not enough information in itself to actually make any kind of a prediction. There's also a lot of qualitative components to this. There's knowing that this is a plant-derived product to begin with. There is the speaking to the API manufacturers, there's speaking to the finished goods manufacturers, there's speaking to the upstream farmers, and trying to communicate around what the future demand is actually likely to look like. So the data in itself is more of like an early warning system or an indication that we need to look over here. But actually, AI gives us the opportunity to try and incorporate a lot of these conversations that happen with these manufacturers. You know, the global health community goes out and speaks with a lot of these people regularly, at least for the medicines that are in the essential medicines list. If we could harvest those notes for sentiment analysis and then run that into a model of volume and price, that would become much more significant and a much better indicator. But again, coming back to the point about who is actually going to administer this, I completely agree that this can't be a global good, publicly available information, and actually that needs to sit within a responsible organization that is able to build policy responses as a consequence of this. What that exactly looks like, that's way above my pay grade.
Thank you, Dan. But I think it's highlighting an important point, which is it's not that you publish, here is a supply chain risk map, and all actors will then take that risk and act on it. You have to be very precise about how you take the output from the analytical machinery and go to, I don't know, in some cases, the agriculture extension worker in China, or those who do advanced contracts with the key extractors of artemisinin or other key starting materials for the oseltamivir example. So you have to be very thoughtful in how to take the output and who do you go to with it, in the absence of having somebody else who manages this. If there was a global entity who was tasked with managing it, in which case that would become easier. But Claudina, within the South African national context, let's say we had a perfect system that was collecting the demand side data, that built all of the supply maps that Dan and Matt have talked about, then how would it be put into practice? How would the NDOH make use of such analytical output?
But before I answer that, I was actually sitting smiling here. Yes, you go through all of this effort of determining how much artemisinin do you need to grow and the whole manufacturing process, and then the mosquitoes decide, no, we're actually going to develop drug resistance. Then all your efforts is just down the drain at that moment. And this is actually one of the realities that's happening. So one of the things that you need to be aware of is actually what is happening in the field of in real life. To what extent is artemisinin-resistant malaria becoming a reality? And it is and this is why one of the things that we're now working with USP and with UNITAID was to look at amodiaquin as a potential. We need to have more than just one drug that is available. So to me, that is where your patient records combined with what is actually reality, your diagnostics that's going in, that information needs to go in as well. So you know this percentage of the population is actually been exposed to drug resistance, TB, HIV, or whatever, because that is going to influence then what are within the next batch of for when you put in your orders, what do you actually need to start ordering? And to me, that is the challenge, is how do you bring all of this then together to make the predictions of what is needed in the field. So now that's why I was sitting smiling, and I think, yes, in reality, although malaria is not a problem in South Africa, because we can do API manufacturing. We are assisting a company in Nigeria to do the actual manufacturing. So, but it is based on the data that we've picked up on what is needed. So that is the kind of where AI can come in, where you not looking at the logistics side, but also to understand the data that's coming from the global health, the data that's coming from TDR, from whoever, To bring all of that together, that is the power of AI, to bring that together and then translate that into, these are the medicines that you will need within the next 3 to 6 months. That is the power of it, that from the top side. And then you need to bring the bottom and the top together. And to me is how do we do that? But otherwise, you need a very effective database program to say that you've run out of this and this and this, please order that. That is in place already. But it is that future, because you're looking at, for example, when you look at your more biological products, you look at a 12 to 6 months lead time to actually manufacture that. And now you've gone through all of this effort to develop the processes, get your PQ from WHO PQ, and you've lots of money spent into putting the facility, and just to find out, but sorry, this disease has decided I'm finding ways around the treatment that you've given. And to me, that is how do we integrate that component then into the predictions of what medicines are needed for future.
Super. I'll use what you said as a question to Dan, which is Claudina's highlighting that the problem is not just trying to predict artemisinin in shortage or artemisinin in supply, but also resistance patterns to artemisinin as they're emerging. Can AI be put to use to look at emerging resistant patterns, what kinds of drugs to use, when to start regimen change, do it nationally, subnationally, do you do different therapies in different regions? Can we put AI and machine learning to solve that problem?
Yeah, so this supply chain data has a whole variety of use cases, as you said right at the beginning of this talk. And as much as it can be about supply security, it can also be about resistance as well. So I actually was a speaker at the WHO meeting on slowing drug-resistant malaria last month in Geneva, where we used our data to show that in Tanzania, the private sector was now accounting for 75% of Artemether lumefantrine supply, and 65% in Kenya and 50% in Uganda. So that government efforts in the public sector just to shape the mix of MFTs in the public sector was not actually going to bend the resistance curve sufficiently if we were not actually taking into account the private sector as well. So these types of supply chain data and analysis, where you're able to bring together public sector and private sector for total market analysis, has way more use cases than just supply shortages. I'm talking today mostly about supply shortages, even though it's probably only about 20% of my time. But I would say that the building the data systems has many more use cases than just supply chain.
So we can effectively solve the problem that Claudina is putting in front of mapping resistance patterns, when to change regimens, etc., using the machinery of AI and machine learning that has become available now, right? Is that fair characterization? We can solve it if there was data for it.
We can improve the base of knowledge.
Okay,
I don't think solve is necessarily the word that I would go for.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Matt, what Dan described and what you were describing earlier points to the fact that in the future, should we be asking for new data sets to come in a more systematic manner so that they can go into the kinds of engines you're building? Who should we go to ask this? Should we ask the regulators that share with us everything that comes in, everything that's registered? The direct material file has the name of your API supplier or KSM supplier. Give us that. Why do I have to spend time imputing that from the trade data, putting my data science engine? Or let's not burden them by asking this question. Our data science tools will impute that from the different data streams, but let's ask them for other things that are crucial that we cannot impute from data today. So if you had to go to the, Chimembe is not here, but let's say the African Medicines Agency or other groups, AUD and NEPAD, and make an ask for areas where they should be collecting systematically more data, what would that be? Or to the US FDA, for example, or the European Medicines Agency or MHRA, whichever other agencies, what would you ask them as to, this is very crucial for progressing my work, start collecting this systematically?
Yeah, I would say, and based on my US experience, so the FDA collects fairly robust data on what are the upstream, active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers for every prescription drug label, and they get into some key starting materials. They are limited by regulations to share that data very broadly. It's pretty tightly controlled on what they're allowed to share. So one option certainly is working with a regulator to improve the data capture collection. Another option that we've implemented in the US is establishing forums where parties can convene and aggregate data that protects their confidentiality concerns. So US Pharmacopeia is a member of the End Drug Shortages Alliance, which is a cross-industry, multi-stakeholder, multi-level platform that allows some of these partners to come together and collaborate and safely, responsibly share data. Yeah, so I'm not sure the specific application for South Africa, but you can definitely work with the regulators to try to get some of that data captured. There's also nonprofits and other organizations that can convene, bringing different regulators and different manufacturers together to share that data.
So I understand that the regulator cannot share the data they have from the DMF with a wider audience, but can they share with, when you are a congressionally created agency for this work, they should be able to share it with you, correct?
That would be nice.
Okay.
That would be nice if they gave me all their data, but they don't. Yeah, but we're supply chain planners are creative, so we will find a solution. And one of the solutions we found was to establish alternative forums that we can convene and sort of aggregate this information responsibly.
Super. Dan, same question. If you were to go to the Pharmacy and Poison Board in Kenya or the African Medicines Agency chief and ask what data should they start collecting and sharing selectively, I'm not saying putting it out in public domain.
Yeah, so with respect to a number of African countries, the import records data and the regulatory import data would be immensely useful if that was more available. That being said, the quality of the data capture at ports in sub-Saharan Africa is not terribly good, and the quality of the data itself, if Indian export records are rough, African import records are significantly worse. So that would be great if it was more available and if the data capture improved a little bit in quality. My big asks, I'm going to put it out into the universe, it's never going to happen, but would be Chinese exports and EU exports would make such a difference in terms of availability of information. Having more data and insights from those places. Getting the World Trade Organization to make more codes for key commodities, for tracking around the world, the harmonized system for trade. For those of you who aren't in the medicine space, a lot of commodities that flow around the world have these HS codes attached to them, and they can describe things reasonably well. But for medicines, we've got 20 codes for 10,000 different medicines. So they all kind of get bundled together, and you don't really know what's moving where. What else can I put in my grab bag of asks? That's probably enough to get started.
So higher quality and more granular export-import data from the regulators, import data for medicines that are coming in at a more granular level than what is in the current HS code will help improve the prediction accuracies of your models.
Yeah, and actually, if we're talking about how you go down to the subnational within country piece, creating more of a marketplace for data so that innovators can put their data in and be rewarded for their data and have people who are willing to pay for high quality data in the healthcare space, more space for innovators to actually have the incentives to design systems and models that will serve the needs and actually place value on the data capture and the quality of the data itself.
Claudina, would you share your insights on what should the South African medicines regulator be doing to help get more systematic data on import, export, so that we can predict supply shortages through such analytical models better?
So one of the activities that we are involved with is to assist the South African regulator to make the system more AI ready, more predictable. So, but for that you need to have, it's a very interesting exercise, the data storage facilities that you suddenly start to need, the electricity that goes with it, then it's a very interesting, yes, you can do all of these fantastic things, but you also need to look at the back end that you need in order to produce the data regularly and to make sure that yes, these are the drugs and the quantities or whatever that's been approved. Then from there it needs to link with the Department of Health on where are the needs for the different drugs and things like that, to have that, the link between that as well. But yeah, so it is that when we start looking at AI and how do we use it within healthcare, it is a very good buzzword on the moment. And we also need to look at what will it actually take within a country to run those AI systems. Or are we going to be dependent on Europe and America to run the AI systems for us locally? So it's part of the discussions that we have is, who's in control of this? Whose information is this? How do you make sure that you, in the end, as a country, benefit from whatever systems, whether it is to make sure that the medicines actually get to the patients, or to a certain extent also protect your own borders to make sure that you can build your own industries at the same time and not give all your data away, so that other countries can sort of move into that data and say, okay, fine, we will use your data, but in the end we will actually make sure that we kill your own companies in the process. So it is that sort of, where do you draw the lines of information that's available? And that is very much the ongoing discussions on, yeah, where do you put the blocks around it? Yeah, thanks.
Great. A question to Matt and Dan. We are so far been talking about the medicines and the health sector. If we step out for a minute and ask, are other sectors doing something similar in proactively predicting shortages or supply risk maps? Have you looked at, with a wider angle lens, what such initiatives are? I remember during the peak of the COVID pandemic, some news reporters were asking me, can you give us a picture of where do roses, this is pre-Valentine's Day in 2021, where do roses come from? So I was digging out little data sets from the Panjiva export-import to say, here is where they come from, Ecuador, Colombia. That's what we want to watch for. So are there other industries that are building something similar, food, agriculture, I don't know, other commodities, that we can also draw some lessons from? So let's start with Matt.
Yeah, so a lot of the models that underlie the medicine supply map I actually took from my first position in the oil industry, in the lubricant space specifically, which is smaller in terms of the number of players, so it's significantly easier to monitor. But they still have the concept of there are some large global manufacturers, there are some regional manufacturers, and you sort of have to constantly match up supply and demand. So there's a lot of good industry benchmarks of people that are doing similar things to look on how to balance supply and demand through AI technologies.
Yeah.
I mean, we spoke about this while we were prepping for this panel. That an example that springs to mind is the World Food Programme's Market Monitor. So for those of you who don't know, the World Food Programme has a market monitor which tracks the prices and availability of wheat, sugar, rice, basic staple commodities to help inform global markets and to ensure security of food supply for the world's population. Now, nothing like that really exists in the healthcare space. And I think the reason probably for that has been the number of molecules and the complexity of attempting to build something like that. But I would argue that it is of a similar sort of global good and need. I have a suspicion that many other industries are much further advanced than the healthcare industry in this space in terms of risk mapping. I mean, if what you said about oil and...
Yeah, I wonder, why do you think that is? Why are we slower than other industries in that sense?
Do you want...
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah. Oh.
That's the problem. Medicines is money. So there is still this proprietary information that will give you the market edge. So yes, we from a government, we can share all of this information, but the big money is within healthcare.
But there's a lot of money in other industries as well.
No, but it's not the same. It is, if you start looking at the different price differentiations across the world, and to me I think it's essential we start analyzing what has actually happened during COVID. The prices of your vaccines and how stockpiling of vaccines happened because the ones who couldn't pay couldn't get it. And that is still underlying all of this sort of, if I give all my data away, am I giving my ability to negotiate away? And that is sort of, it's more of a complex price of the price of sugar. So price of sugar is more, it's easier to manufacture sugar than it is to manufacture your Spikevax or one of those, because the money is in who holds the intermediaries, the raw products, and the APIs. That is where the money is.
So one side is that, for basic commodities, it's easier because there's less money, like sugar or food or things like that, as compared to medicines. But I want to bring out an example, which is a former student from many years ago runs the supply risk management function for a very large tech company in California. Every morning, first 9 o'clock meeting is when she tells the executive team, what does the supply risk map look like this morning? And because the supplier base is based globally, right, every potential risk event, an earthquake in region, probability of a war, or every single event is tracked, and the supplier risk map is presented every morning, 9 o'clock, right? Just one snapshot. So it's a tech company. It invests significant amount of money to understand their supplier risk using all kinds of data and machine learning. So my question is, USP is doing this, USP is a nonprofit, you're doing this, you're a startup, Department of Health is doing this. Are the companies themselves, when I say companies, the companies that develop and manufacture medicines, investing sufficiently in understanding their supply risk? Are they putting AI and machine learning to understand, similar to the tech company example I gave you? Or do you not see that much happening in the pharma industry? Matt.
So we do see a lot of our customers have very robust mappings of their upstream supply chain, but they don't really have any sort of incentive to share that information. So there's no competitive reason to share it. So I think from our standpoint, this isn't frequently a technical challenge. The technical challenge behind AI and some of these models with neural nets being largely open source code, these are not hard models to design. The hard part is getting people together to convene the information where they trust you and that the convening the information is providing enough value to them ultimately. And from our perspective, in these tough conversations where you're negotiating, essentially sharing confidential information across stakeholders, we find that if you focus on the patient and the patient outcome, the discussions become significantly easier. So focus on what is best for patient security, what is best for ensuring the supply of essential medicines, and a lot of these negotiations are much easier.
Dan?
I just wanted to come back very quickly and say, I think when I was saying that the healthcare industry is not quite as good at supply chain, I think I was maybe projecting a little bit of the global health community's failings as opposed to big pharma in the US, which I imagine is putting a lot more money. But then again, that comes back to a question about resource and how much are you going to invest in that supply security piece. So yeah, that's, sorry, just wanted to get that in.
So companies may be doing it, both of you say companies may be doing it, companies implying global life sciences companies, but either it's not available for multiple actors to be used, that remains specific to within a company. And what Dan is highlighting is that the global health community, which means people who act on behalf of low and middle income countries to improve access to medicines, they may not have access to what may be happening inside a company. That's where these efforts are sort of building on or adding to what companies may be doing themselves. Is that a fair way of characterizing what you said, Dan? And
yeah,
Matt?
and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and a lot of lessons to be learned from a lot of people in this room as well in other industries.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes. Let's go to, from what you highlighted, lessons to be learned from the people in the room. Questions, comments, anything that you'd like to highlight? Yes, here. I don't know if you have microphones, they're bringing it to you. So they're bringing it, I think somebody from the back is bringing you a microphone.
Can AI help to reduce the wastage caused by expired medicines? And can recycling expired medicines help to mitigate supply risk?
Can I take that one?
Yep.
So there are some really interesting models being built around looking at the distribution of what you need is you need real-time stock information at a facility level. And then you can look at which facilities have too much stock and which facilities don't have enough stock, and you can look to redistribute within a network. And that is possible within countries, but it's also actually possible at an international level. There's a thing called the GFP-VAN, which is a reproductive health supply chain coalition, which looks to move family planning commodities from countries that have too many where it's going to expire to countries that don't have enough. It sounds easy in theory. It's very messy in practice. And actually, I think the malaria community is potentially about to build something similar. But in theory, yes. In practice, tough.
Other questions, comments?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Merlin from Project Last Mile. The question I have is probably more of a practical one in terms of, we know AI is good at linking multiple sources of data. It's one of its strengths. And so from a health perspective, if we're taking, for example, a patient, we can look at a unique identifier as a key component to look at patients' health profiles, linking to their financials, demographics, etc., to create then a patient profile that you can do some sort of predictive modeling around. In terms of supply chain, what do we think those critical data elements should be? I hear a lot of the corporate politics, but in South Africa, if you consider 85% of patients are serviced through the public sector, there's a lot of information that exists in that space that could alleviate all these challenges about data sharing. So what data should we be looking for? And is it possible to get it from the public sector in order for us to develop these predictive models?
Claudina?
I wish. One of the discussions with the National Department of Health within the context of the National Health Insurance is to see to what extent they are prepared to share patient data. At this moment, it is no. Ideally, yes. Within your patient record, you've got all the elements that's needed for the for your diagnostics, for your drugs, for determining where the healthcare workers need to be concentrating and so on. But in the moment, because of the patient confidentiality, the information is not being shared. So it is one of the things that we are in negotiation to see to what extent they will let go, and we can access the data then to build the system for more predictions on what is needed where. But the issue around patient confidentiality and how do you the safeguarding of the information is actually one of the major things. How do you stop a breach of information and things like that? So this is why those areas still need to be sorted out. So the data is there, but to access the data is the problem.
One theme that I hope you are seeing emerge from the questions, responses of the panelists is that we are talking less about the engines for doing the analytics. That part we've solved. It's the data, where to get it, how to solve the fragmentation problem, how to solve the sharing problem. That's where much of the discussion is. So that at least gives us clarity of where the field needs more work. But in the last 30 seconds or so, very quickly, 10-second responses, where do you see the field going? 2 years from now, if we come back to a panel, what would be a more exciting thing that you will tell us, Matt?
So success, we'll just be optimistic here. Success in 2 years involves these stakeholders coming together to collaborate. So thank you everyone for their participation and attendance today. But these sort of conferences, building the connections, enable the collaborative environments that ultimately ensure the steady supply of access of critical medications for patients.
Dan?
So success for me would be potentially some sort of a convening body or some overarching body that could take on this work and house it, or just the agreement that this data should sit somewhere and that it should be somebody's job to try and aggregate it and put it together, would be an enormous step for me. Failing that, I would say that if the data could be used by local manufacturers to better understand their markets, if the data could be used by governments to help design policy, if we could not approach this solely as a supply-side security problem, but also recognize the use of supply chain data in all other elements of the pharmaceutical policy landscape as well.
Claudina?
I think he summed it up quite nicely. Yes. The supply chain challenges are just sort of the end of all the other issues that needs to be sorted out with regard to the data and where do you get the data and how do you actually utilize that. So it is just sort of, it is the easy one because you know you can more predict, but what feeds into it, the actual patient records, the information about the patients. And I'm not even touching on pharmacogenomics, because that is one of the things that you also need to start bringing into this whole thing. And then the supply chain is the easy part to sort out, but the rest, how to get the data and how to analyze the data, and that is where your actual use of AI will come in. For supply chain is basically a computer program that you need.
Okay, superb. So let's thank our panel here. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you again.
Hi, so thank you very much to all the panelists, and Prashant, he jumped in at the last minute. We had a cancellation, so well done. Excellent job there.